Grandma, Dad said to give you this if you ever pretended I wasn't part of this family again. The entire room froze. The clink of silverware, the rustling of fancy napkins, the hum of conversation. It all just vanished, like someone sucked the air right out of the Thanksgiving dinner. 30 people sat around that long, polished mahogany table, under a glittering chandelier. Plates piled with turkey and sweet potato casserole, but not a single soul dared move, except for my 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, standing there in her golden dress, tiny hands gripping a small red gift box like it weighed 1,000 pounds. And Evelyn, my mother-in-law, sitting at the head of the table in her pearl necklace and perfectly ironed cream suit, stared at Sophie with a polite, frozen smile, like she was praying this was some cute kid's joke, and not the beginning of her world collapsing. I could see a twitch in Evelyn's jaw, just under her cheekbone. The kind of twitch that happens when someone's mask starts to crack. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't a cute joke. This was the day we stopped pretending. Sophie's voice had been soft, but it sliced through the room like a blade. Her little curls bounced around her shoulders as she looked straight at Evelyn. Eyes big, shining, determined. Behind her, my husband, Mark, sat stiff as stone. His hand lay flat on the table, fingers pressed so hard into the wood that his knuckles were white. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because this was the moment he'd been preparing for, ever since the day he gave that box to Sophie and told her she could decide when it was time. It's funny how an entire life can flip in a single breath. A moment ago, laughter had been echoing off the high Victorian ceilings. Evelyn's voice had been booming over everyone else's, bragging about Lily's piano recitals and Connor's travel baseball tournaments. But now, it was silent enough to hear the crackle of the fireplace. And in that silence, my daughter, my brave, sweet Sophie, had called out the one truth that Evelyn had spent years trying to bury. And I sat there, heart pounding, watching Evelyn blink at that red box, knowing that inside it was the one thing she couldn't deny. Proof that Sophie wasn't just Mark's girl, but his daughter in every single way that mattered. And that if Evelyn kept trying to erase her, she was about to lose far more than just the perfect image she'd worked so hard to protect. When I first met Mark, I truly believed I'd stumbled into the perfect American dream. He was warm, funny, gentle, the kind of man who'd hold the door for strangers and remember the exact way you take your coffee. We met in a little bookshop in Cambridge, not far from Harvard Square. He dropped a pile of history books right at my feet, and when I looked up into those dark green eyes, I thought maybe all those cheesy love stories had been onto something. Mark came from a family that seemed like a postcard old Boston money, traditions stretching back generations, Sunday dinners in elegant dining rooms, and Christmas photos where everyone wore coordinated sweaters and smiled the exact same smile. And at the center of all that was Evelyn, my mother-in-law. She was the kind of woman who could silence an entire room with a single look. A retired history professor from Boston University, with a closet full of crisp blazers and perfectly styled silver hair. She hosted charity galas. She sat on museum boards. And she had a voice that sounded so sweet until you realized every sentence carried a hidden test you were meant to pass. In the beginning, she welcomed me with open arms. She'd compliment my cooking, pat my hand at family dinners, tell me how refreshing it was that I wasn't intimidated by Boston high society. But the truth was, it all felt like an audition, like I was standing on stage, waiting for her final verdict on whether I belonged in her family's carefully curated narrative. And then Sophie came into the picture, my beautiful girl, with her wild curls and big brown eyes. Sophie was from my first marriage. She was only 2 when Mark came into our lives. And from the very first moment he met her, Mark loved her without hesitation. He'd kneel down to tie her shoes. He'd build pillow forts in the living room. He'd read her bedtime stories in silly voices that made her giggle until she couldn't breathe. When we got married, he adopted her legally. In our home, we never used the word step. Sophie was his daughter, period. But to Evelyn, it was never that simple. At first, she'd pretend to accept Sophie. She'd bring a small stuffed animal to Christmas. She'd send a card on Sophie's birthday. But little cracks started showing. Sophie wasn't included in the group texts planning matching family pajamas for holiday photos. She was never invited to the cousins' sleepovers at Evelyn's house on Beacon Hill. Evelyn would gush about Lily's perfect piano recitals or Connor's Little League wins. Then turn to Sophie and say things like, "Sweetheart, you remind me so much of your mother. You're so independent." There was always a pause there, a hesitation, as if she was carefully choosing words that sounded polite, but left Sophie standing on the outside looking in. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. I'd tell myself, "Evelyn's old school, she doesn't mean it, she'll come around." But each year, it got a little harder to believe that, because children notice, they always notice. One Thanksgiving, Evelyn gave each grandchild a personalized place setting with their names painted in gold calligraphy. Sophie's plate was a leftover piece of plain white china from the back of the cabinet. That night, as we were driving home through the glittering Boston streets, Sophie stared out the car window and whispered, "Do you think Grandma just thinks I'm visiting?" And my heart cracked into 1,000 pieces. Mark was silent beside me, his jaw set tight. And for the first time, I realized that maybe he was finally starting to see it too. But even then, I kept telling myself to stay quiet, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person, because deep down, I was terrified of being the reason Mark would have to choose between his mother and the little family we were trying to build. So I swallowed my hurt. I smiled at family parties. I told Sophie that Grandma was just busy or forgetful, but every time I said those words, I felt like I was slowly teaching my daughter that being treated like less was something she was supposed to accept. As the years rolled on, the cracks in Evelyn's perfect porcelain mask grew deeper and sharper. And the truth was, no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, Sophie felt every single one. It wasn't just the forgotten texts anymore, or the missing invitations to cousin sleepovers. It was the way Evelyn would tilt her head, eyes narrowing just a fraction, whenever Sophie ran up to hug her, or how she'd purse her lips when someone introduced Sophie as Evelyn's granddaughter. But the worst part was how beautifully Evelyn cloaked it all in polite words and polite smiles. So that half the time, I wondered if I was the crazy one. Then came the year Evelyn hosted the family's annual photo shoot for the Christmas card. We all showed up at a photography studio near the Boston Commons, wearing carefully coordinated navy and ivory outfits. Lily and Connor stood front and center, grinning with that photogenic sparkle Evelyn adored. But when the photographer tried to place Sophie beside them, Evelyn stepped forward and said, in her syrupy sweet voice, "Oh, maybe Sophie should stand on the end, so we don't mess up the balance." And just like that, my daughter, who was bursting with excitement in her navy dress and sparkly shoes, was shoved to the very edge of the photo, half cropped out in most of the shots Evelyn proudly mailed out later. A few weeks after that, I logged into Facebook and saw Evelyn's holiday post. The caption read, "So grateful for family." The photo was there, the one with Sophie edited out completely. I stared at the screen so long that my eyes burned. And I felt like screaming, but I didn't. Instead, I closed my laptop, went into Sophie's room, and helped her pick out her outfit for her school holiday concert, pretending nothing was wrong. Because I kept clinging to this stupid idea that maybe next year would be different, that maybe Evelyn would finally see Sophie the way Mark and I did. But hope kept getting harder to hang on to, especially as more ugly truths kept slipping through the cracks. One spring, Mark and I found out that Evelyn had quietly opened 2 large college savings accounts for Lily and Connor, Sophie's name wasn't anywhere on the paperwork. Mark confronted his mother gently, because that's how he always handled Evelyn. But Evelyn just smiled that tight, rehearsed smile and said, "Well, honey, blood is blood." I think that was the first time I truly felt something inside me snap. But I still didn't say anything, because I was terrified of being painted as the problem. I convinced myself that keeping quiet was protecting Sophie, that being the bigger person was noble, but all it did was chip away at me. And at my little girl. Sophie grew quieter around Evelyn. She'd glance at me during family gatherings, like silently asking permission to speak. She stopped running into Evelyn's arms the way she used to. She started asking questions that made my heart ache. Why doesn't Grandma ever sit next to me at dinner? Why did Grandma tell Lily I'm not really her cousin? Mark would try to soothe her. He'd kneel beside her, hug her tight, and say, "Grandma just gets confused sometimes." But I could see the guilt simmering beneath his words. He knew. He saw it, same as I did. And I think that's why, one night after Sophie went to bed, he finally confessed to me that he'd been working on something. Something he kept hidden in his closet, high up on the shelf behind his suits. A box. A simple red box. He told me, in a voice that trembled even though he was trying to sound steady. I printed Sophie's adoption papers again. I wrote my mother a letter. I want Sophie to have the power to decide when enough is enough. I stared at him, shocked. "Mark, you did all that without telling me?" He nodded. "I couldn't keep watching her question whether she belongs, and I couldn't keep putting you in the middle. This is for Sophie, so she knows that I see her, that she's ours. For the first time in years, I saw the man I fell in love with, the man who would fight for the people he loved, even if he did it in quiet, hidden ways. And yet, part of me was terrified, because if Sophie ever handed Evelyn that box, there'd be no going back. No more pretending we were one big happy family. No more polite silence for the sake of appearances. Only truth. And truth, in Evelyn's world, was the one thing that could tear everything apart. Thanksgiving crept up faster than I wanted it to. Boston's trees were shedding the last of their brilliant red and gold leaves, and the chill in the air felt sharper somehow, like it was hinting that this holiday wasn't going to be the same as all the others. Evelyn, of course, was determined to make Thanksgiving spectacular. She sent out engraved invitations weeks in advance. She ordered a massive heritage turkey from some specialty farm in Vermont. And she made sure everyone knew this dinner was important for family unity, as if the weight of our entire bloodline depended on one perfect night under her crystal chandelier. I remember standing in our kitchen, staring at the list of dishes I'd promised to bring: bourbon-glazed carrots, homemade cranberry sauce, pumpkin cheesecake, and feeling my stomach twist. Because deep down, I knew. This was the year something was going to break. It started a week before the holiday, when Sophie came home from school with a handmade Thanksgiving card for Evelyn. She'd drawn a big family table, with tiny figures labeled Mom, Dad, and me, all sitting together. In the corner, she'd written, in her neatest handwriting, "I'm thankful that Daddy picked me." I felt my throat tighten so hard I almost couldn't breathe. And I knew right then Sophie remembered the box. She remembered everything. Mark was quiet the entire week leading up to Thanksgiving. At night, he'd lie next to me in bed, staring at the ceiling, as if running through invisible conversations he'd never had the courage to say out loud. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing toward his closet, where the red box sat hidden behind his navy suits. On Wednesday night, Sophie wandered into our bedroom, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny. "Daddy," she whispered, "can I still give Grandma the box if she's mean again?" Mark sat up, his voice low and shaking a little. "Yes, sweetheart, it's yours. You get to choose when." Sophie nodded, solemn as a judge, and I realized my little girl was carrying a burden far too heavy for any 7-year-old. Thanksgiving morning dawned bright and bitterly cold. Boston's skyline glittered in the sunlight as we drove through the city toward Evelyn's grand Victorian house in Beacon Hill. Sophie sat in the back seat, wearing a new golden dress she'd picked herself, curls bouncing, clutching the red box in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't ask if things would be different this year. She just stared out the window, eyes steady, like she'd already decided exactly what she was going to do. When we pulled up, Evelyn's house looked like the cover of a lifestyle magazine. A massive wreath of orange and gold leaves hung on the door. Warm light spilled from the windows, and inside we could hear laughter, music, the clinking of champagne flutes. I tried to swallow the rising panic crawling up my chest. As we stepped inside, Evelyn swooped down on Lily and Connor first, kissing their cheeks, exclaiming over how tall they'd gotten. Then she turned to Sophie, gave her a polite, distant hug, and said, "Aren't you festive today, sweetheart?" That was it. No compliment on her dress, no warmth in her voice. Just that same thin smile that never quite reached her eyes. Sophie's fingers tightened around the red box. I felt my entire body stiffen. Dinner was a blur of forced conversation and polite laughter. 30 people crowded around Evelyn's long mahogany table, silver candlesticks flickering in the soft light. Mark barely spoke, just pushed his food around his plate while Evelyn held court at the head of the table, bragging about Lily's piano recital and Connor's upcoming travel baseball tournament. I kept glancing at Sophie, who sat perfectly still, her napkin folded neatly in her lap, eyes darting between Evelyn and Mark. And with every story Evelyn told about Lily and Connor, I watched Sophie shrink a little more into herself. After dessert, a towering pecan pie, Evelyn made sure everyone knew she'd baked from scratch. Evelyn announced it was time for gifts. A new tradition, she said, because families should be generous and thankful. She handed Lily a slim white box containing diamond stud earrings. She gave Connor a brand new Apple Watch. Everyone clapped and oohed and ahed. Then Evelyn reached under the table and pulled out a tiny gift bag. She held it up, waving it lightly in the air, and said with that same sugary voice, "And for Sophie, just a little something so you're not completely left out." The words hung in the air like poison. My ears rang so hard I could barely hear Evelyn hand Sophie the gift bag. Inside was a plain vanilla-scented candle. No sparkle, no personal touch. Just a tag that read to Mark's girl, not granddaughter. Not family, just Mark's girl. I felt my pulse thudding like a drum in my temples. I turned to look at Mark. He was staring down at his plate, shoulders rigid. Fingers locked so tight together his wedding ring looked like it might cut into his skin. And that was when I knew. The time for pretending was over. Because my daughter was no longer going to let herself be invisible. And neither was I. Sophie sat there for a second, holding that candle in her lap like it was radioactive. The soft glow from the chandelier overhead caught on the glass jar, making the cheap vanilla wax sparkle as if it deserved a place beside diamond earrings and Apple Watches. But Sophie didn't look at the candle. She looked at me. Her eyes were huge, dark, searching my face for permission, or maybe courage. And then, with a deep breath so tiny I almost missed it, she stood up. Her chair scraped back across the polished wood floor, loud enough to make several people flinch. The entire table turned to stare at her. 30 pairs of eyes all at once. Even Evelyn, who was busy tucking the gift bags back under the table, froze mid-motion. Sophie's voice was soft, but it carried. "Grandma, Dad said to give you this if you ever pretended I wasn't part of this family again." A ripple passed through the room like a silent earthquake. Forks dropped. Someone gasped. I heard the faint clink of a wine glass tipping over somewhere down the table. But all I could see was my little girl, standing there with her curls bouncing around her shoulders, holding out that small red box like it was the single most important thing in the world. Evelyn blinked at her, a smile frozen on her lips, as if waiting for the punchline to some harmless joke. "Honey, what's this about?" she asked, her voice light, with an edge so sharp it could have sliced glass. But Sophie didn't answer. She just stepped forward and placed the box right in front of Evelyn's charger plate. Careful and deliberate. Like she was setting down a sacred offering. Then she sat back down, folding her hands in her lap, eyes fixed on her grandmother. Mark finally moved. He reached under the table and found my hand, squeezing it so tight it almost hurt. I felt my throat close up as Evelyn picked up the box, turning it over slowly, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling just the slightest bit. Her voice came out thinner now. "What's in here, sweetheart?" Still, Sophie said nothing. The silence was deafening. Even the crackle of the fireplace seemed to pause, like the house itself was holding its breath. Evelyn peeled away the red wrapping paper with sharp, careful tugs. Beneath it was a plain white cardboard box. She lifted the lid and stopped. Inside, resting on a bed of soft tissue paper, was a photograph. It was a candid shot of Mark in a hospital chair, wearing blue scrubs, cradling a tiny Sophie on his chest. Sophie's cheeks were streaked with frosting from her second birthday cake. And written in neat gold script under the photo were 3 words, "Day 1 Dad." Evelyn stared at it for a long moment, her eyes darting back and forth like she was trying to convince herself she was hallucinating. But she wasn't. Beneath the photo was a sealed ivory envelope. Her fingers shook as she pulled it free and unfolded the letter inside. Mark's handwriting was instantly recognizable. Strong, slightly slanted, neat, but forceful. As she read, Evelyn's lips moved silently. Her face drained of color, pale as the linen tablecloth beneath her trembling hands. Mark's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "Mom, if Sophie had to give you that box, then it means you crossed a line. The same line you've been dancing around for years." Evelyn looked up sharply, but he held her gaze. "I have watched you, over and over. Make my daughter feel like she doesn't belong, and I'm done pretending it's harmless. Sophie is my child by choice, by law, and by love. If you can't accept her as your granddaughter, then you will not be part of our lives." A sharp gasp sliced through the table. Evelyn sputtered, voice rising, brittle and panicked. "You're choosing her over your own mother." Mark didn't even blink. "I'm choosing my family. All of it. And that includes my daughter." The room exploded in whispers and shifting chairs. Connor's fork clattered to his plate. Lily's eyes filled with tears. Evelyn's sister, Marion, reached out a trembling hand like she wanted to calm her. But Evelyn jerked away. "This girl," Evelyn hissed, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "She's poisoned you against me. She's turned you into this stranger." I stood up so fast my chair nearly toppled over. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Because my voice was iron when I said, "Don't blame me. Evelyn, your granddaughter gave you a gift. She gave you the chance to see her. You chose not to. For a heartbeat." All you could hear was the faint hum of the heating vents and the wind rattling the windows. Evelyn's face twisted in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for a way to spin this into her narrative. The narrative where she was the victim. But there was no salvaging it. Because the truth was there. In that photo, in that letter, in the eyes of the little girl who finally refused to be invisible. And in the man who finally stood up and declared once and for all whose side he was on. Evelyn slammed the letter down on the table so hard the silverware rattled. "I can't believe you'd humiliate me like this." On Thanksgiving, Mark's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "We didn't humiliate you. Mom, you did that all by yourself." Evelyn pushed back her chair, the wooden legs shrieking against the floor. She grabbed her purse with shaking hands, eyes wild and glistening, and hissed, "Don't you dare come crawling back when you realize what you've lost." And just like that, she stormed out, leaving the perfect Thanksgiving table in ruins. Lily started crying quietly. Connor just stared at his half-eaten pie. And for a long moment, no one moved. Then Sophie looked up at Mark and whispered, "Daddy, do you think Grandma read the whole letter?" Mark's eyes softened. "Every single word, sweetheart." And Sophie, she smiled, Not big, not dramatic, but enough to tell me that something deep inside her had finally settled. For a few seconds after Evelyn disappeared through the dining room doors, it felt like the entire house was still vibrating from the force of her exit. People shifted in their chairs, eyes darting everywhere, as if afraid to speak too loudly and shatter the silence. The chandelier above the table seemed to sway just slightly, its crystals catching the glow of the fireplace, casting fractured sparks of light across the stunned faces staring at us. Sophie was the first one to move. She carefully placed the vanilla candle on the table beside her untouched plate and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't look scared. She didn't look confused. She just looked calm. Mark finally let go of my hand. He scrubbed both palms over his face, like he was trying to wipe away years of tension and secrets. A single sharp sound broke the hush, the delicate click of a dessert fork hitting a china plate. Connor blinked rapidly and whispered, Are we still having pie?" Lily burst into tears. Marion, Evelyn's sister, leaned across the table and whispered, "Julia, I never knew. I swear. I didn't realize it was so bad." But the truth was, they all knew. On some level, they'd all seen the way Evelyn divided the family into those who belonged and those who didn't. They'd just never thought someone would finally say it out loud. Mark stood up, voice low but firm. "We're leaving." I rose, my chair scraping back. Sophie slid off her seat and came to my side, clutching the empty red box in both hands like a trophy she'd won in battle. People murmured our names as we made our way around the table, grabbing coats draped over chairs. Some reached out to touch my arm, eyes wide, whispering things like, "I'm so sorry," or "Please don't let this break the family." But I didn't answer, because I knew the family had been broken for a long time. We were just the first ones willing to say it out loud. Outside, Boston's streets were crisp and cold. A thin dusting of early snow coated the sidewalks, glittering under the glow of old-fashioned street lamps. We walked in silence to the car. Mark opened the door for Sophie, who climbed in without a word, still holding the box like it contained the beating heart of our entire family. As he slid into the driver's seat, Mark exhaled a shaky breath and whispered, "I should have done this years ago." I touched his arm gently. "You did it exactly when she needed you to." He nodded, staring out at the snow swirling under the lamplight. In the back seat, Sophie leaned forward between our seats and asked, in the softest voice, "Are we still a family?" Mark turned around, his eyes shining under the glow of the dashboard lights. "The best kind of family, baby, one that doesn't make you earn your place." Sophie let out a long sigh and leaned back against her seat, hugging the red box to her chest. For the first time all night, her small shoulders relaxed. And I realized, sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't loud. Sometimes they happen in quiet rooms, at elegant dinner tables, under crystal chandeliers. And sometimes the bravest person in the room is the smallest one. We didn't go back to Evelyn's house after that night. No more forced birthday parties. No more matching sweaters for holiday photos. No more pretending. At first, I thought Sophie would ask about her. I braced myself for tears, for guilt, for sleepless nights trying to explain why family sometimes becomes strangers. But instead, Sophie seemed lighter. She stopped glancing over her shoulder during family gatherings, like she was waiting to be left out. She stopped hesitating before speaking up, afraid of being too loud or too different. She just exhaled, and in that space Evelyn left behind, we started building something new. Small traditions, quiet ones. Things that belonged just to us. We made pancakes on Sunday mornings and let Sophie stir the batter. Even when flour dusted the entire kitchen, we built a blanket fort in the living room and spent a whole weekend watching movies in pajamas. We adopted a rescue dog, a goofy golden retriever named Charlie, who decided Sophie was his entire universe. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't magazine perfect, but it was real. One afternoon, a week after Thanksgiving, a padded envelope arrived in the mail addressed to Sophie. Inside was a silver bracelet with a tiny heart charm and a handwritten note from Lily. It said, "I'm sorry Grandma was mean. You're my cousin forever. I bought this with my own allowance." Sophie read the note twice, running her fingertip over the neat letters, then slipped the bracelet onto her wrist and didn't take it off for days. And that single act meant more than any expensive gift Evelyn ever gave, because it reminded us that blood doesn't always define family. Kindness does. Meanwhile, Mark seemed like a different man. I'd spent so many years watching him shrink into silence whenever Evelyn was near, trying to keep the peace while burying his own anger. But after that night, something in him unlocked. He laughed more. He spoke his mind. And he no longer carried that quiet, restless guilt that used to keep him pacing the floors after everyone else was asleep. One evening, I found him sitting on the edge of Sophie's bed, watching her sleep. The soft glow of her nightlight cast warm shadows across his face. He looked up at me and said, "I thought standing up to my mother would destroy everything. But it turns out, the only thing it destroyed was the lie we'd been living." I sat beside him, leaning my head against his shoulder. "It didn't destroy us," I whispered. "It set us free." A few days later, on a quiet Saturday morning, I did something I'd been afraid to do for years. I opened up my laptop, filmed myself in the kitchen, and shared our story online. Not to drag Evelyn through the mud, but because I wanted people to know they weren't alone. I spoke about how easy it is to excuse cruel behavior in the name of family, how silence can become complicity, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose peace over pretending. The video went viral. Within days, messages poured in from strangers all over the country. People shared stories of parents who rejected them, siblings who shut them out, relatives who made them feel like outsiders in their own bloodlines. Toxic family started trending on TikTok. So did the chosen family. I read every comment. Some made me cry. Others made me feel braver than I ever thought I could be. And through all those stories, I realized we were never alone. There are countless people carrying wounds inflicted by the people who were supposed to love them most. And sometimes all they need is permission to say enough. The week before Christmas, Sophie stood in the living room, holding up her wrist to show me the silver bracelet glinting in the lights of our tree. "I think I'm going to wear this forever," she said. I smiled, brushing a curl off her cheek. "I think you should, because that bracelet wasn't just a gift. It was proof that love can come from the places you least expect. And that sometimes family isn't who shares your blood, but who sees you, chooses you, and stands beside you when it matters most. If there's one thing this whole storm taught me, it's that silence is not the same as peace. For years, I believed that biting my tongue, swallowing my hurt, and forcing a smile was noble, that keeping the family together was worth any price. But every time I chose quiet over truth, I taught my daughter that love was something she had to earn, and that belonging was a privilege instead of a birthright. I won't do that anymore, because family isn't just a word for the people who share your DNA. Family is the people who see you, who fight for you, who make you feel safe when the world tries to make you small. Sometimes blood ties mean everything. Sometimes they mean nothing at all. And there's nothing shameful about choosing to protect your own peace, even if it means walking away from the people who claim to love you most. Sophie taught me that. She's only 7 years old, but she stood up in a room full of adults and said, "I belong here." She reminded me that sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truth, and that real love never asks you to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's comfort zone. If you're listening to this right now, and you've ever felt like you're on the outside of your own family, if you've ever questioned your worth because of someone else's coldness or cruelty, I want you to hear me. You don't have to earn your place. You deserve to be loved for exactly who you are, and you are not alone. It might hurt to draw boundaries. It might leave you trembling with fear that you're blowing up your world, but I promise, the peace that comes after is worth every single tear. Because the family you build with honesty and respect even if it's smaller, will be stronger than any forced tradition or polished holiday photo. So choose the people who choose you back. Even if it's just a few, even if it's only yourself for a while. And if you have children, show them that love is not silent suffering, but the courage to speak up when someone tries to erase them. I keep that red box in a drawer in my bedroom, right next to Sophie's first baby shoes and the hospital bracelet from the day she was born. Not because I want to remember the pain, but because I want to remember the strength it took to face it, the strength in my daughter's voice, the quiet power in her choice, and the moment our family finally stopped pretending and started living free. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of someone you're fighting for, or someone you finally stood up to, I hope you know this. You're braver than you think. You're worthy of love that doesn't keep score. And sometimes, the hardest truth spoken out loud is the first step toward finally feeling safe and home.